Madam Chair, for the record, my name is Jeremy Aguero, and I'm going to, with your permission, I'm going to take the lead in sort of opening up the beginning elements of a presentation that has been provided to each one of you. I want to extend my thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I realize that this is a long legislative session, and as the Chief of Staff said, your time is remarkably valuable. So I've intended, I think we have intended to try and be direct and straightforward relative to the elements of our testimony here today. There's been a lot of work that has been done, and more than happy to answer any questions, Madam Chair, that you or the joint committees may have. With your permission, I'll just go ahead and jump into it.
Please go ahead, Mr. Aguero, and welcome.
Thank you, ma'am. The presentation that's in front of you today has 6 component parts. I'm going to walk through each of those 6. I'll take some of them, Mr. Hill take some of them, and Treasurer Conine will take some of them as well. As you know, Senate Bill 509 provides a number of key elements relative to facilitating the potential construction of a Major League Baseball stadium in Southern Nevada. Would allow a team, the Oakland A's, to relocate to Las Vegas. In terms of that, there's been a lot of conversation and frankly, a lot of change relative to the programming. We can go through some of that history, but where we are today is probably germane to the conversation we're here to have. The project that is being be constructed on 9 acres located at the site of the Tropicana Resort in Southern Nevada. That's the corner of Tropicana Avenue and Las Vegas Boulevard. The facility would have roughly 30,000 seats, 30,000 capacity, if you will, and have a partially retractable roof as it's designed. The total project cost is presently estimated at about $1.5 billion. We'll talk more about the structure of the financing underlying this particular project. But as I put in the parentheses below, not less than $1.1 billion being contributed by the athletics organization. I included in your packets a handful of charts and exhibits. I realize that, and maps, I guess, and renderings. I realize some of these have been in the public already, and so you've seen them, but it always feels helpful to me to be able to get a sense of what we're talking about and where. This first map provides a regional map. I'm sure everyone in here is generally familiar with our resort corridor and where the corner of Tropicana Avenue and Las Vegas Boulevard is. The facility is generally situated on the southeast corner of Tropicana Avenue and Las Vegas Boulevard. I'll talk more about its specific configuration as we continue to go through, but I've highlighted exactly where that is. On our map, you see some other elements that are there. I'll maybe highlight just a few of them. You see the T-Mobile Arena that is immediately across both Las Vegas Boulevard and Tropicana Avenue. You see Allegiant Stadium there. We'll talk as we go through about any number of things, but one of the elements that's important here is sort of a rank out of venues in the Southern Nevada market. Obviously, the Allegiant Stadium, the largest of those venues we have in Southern Nevada, 62,500 seats, and house more than that under various configurations. T-Mobile Arena, 19,500. Again, different seating with different configurations. And this facility with a proposed capacity of roughly 30,000 overall. Some of the renderings that have been provided, I included in the presentation deck. I won't spend a whole lot of time here other than to mention what has come up a number of times, and that is the importance of maintaining the quality of our resort corridor. We hear it, we talk about it a lot. We talk about 150,000 hotel rooms. We talk about 250,000 leisure and hospitality employees. We talk about the importance of assets like Harry Reid International Airport. What the bill specifically requires is that the A's must build a first-class facility that rivals anything in Major League Baseball, they are also required to maintain that throughout the 30-year life of the facility. You get a sense of how it's expected to look. And again, I think it's important to note that these are renderings based on general expectations. The design process they will go through that, and ultimately it will be designed around that. But the facility in and of itself has a capacity of roughly 30,000. And is designed to be a key asset along our Las Vegas Strip. And another rendering from looking across Las Vegas Boulevard back toward with the facility actually closed, and then what the expected view is looking from essentially behind home plate directly out toward MGM Grand, New York, and other hotel properties that are to the north and northwest of the property itself. The project timeline has also been a question that's come up throughout this process. The project timeline, and obviously without saying that this is all aspirational. We are here with you today in 2023 in the hopes that this body can come together and find a pathway forward to have legislation enable what we're talking about here today. Major League Baseball has signaled on multiple occasions, including very recently that's been made national news about its expectation to take up this issue as early as next month relative to providing the league's approval for the A's to relocate from Oakland to Las Vegas. The next element on my chart is when site construction begins. And obviously, there's a lot of work that happens between late 2024 or early 2025 when site construction begins. Right? This facility is the current location of where the Tropicana Hotel exists today. It has to be demolished in order for this and other development activity to take place. We're going to talk a lot as we go through the bill about the various agreements that are required in order to facilitate a project like this. Development agreement, lease agreement, non-relocation agreements. Many things have to take place. The Stadium Authority Board has to do its job in making a number of findings. It ultimately has to request to Clark County for the issuance of bonds. The treasurer has to be involved in terms of creating a credit enhancement. This is a simple timeline for purposes of making it clear how those things take place, but there are many, many things that will take place between these blocks. The expectation is that site construction will begin in late 2024. In early 2025, construction is expected to be completed in 2028, and the first game expected to be in spring of 2028. The facility that's being constructed is different in many ways. Certainly the expectation or the hope is that the level that is required by Senate Bill 509 is that it will become an asset, something that we can all be very proud of. But it also takes the Oakland A's from playing in among the largest venues in Major League Baseball to playing in its smallest venue in Major League Baseball. This is an important point overall because the expectation here is that the A's are going to generate about 20,000 people that are going to attend those games. Different levels, we talk about concerts and other special events, and we'll talk more about that as we continue to go through. But what the A's are talking about doing is building a facility that is configured and designed to the size of demand. They in doing so, creating an opportunity to drive demand and in some ways perhaps drive scarcity overall. That facility is designed very intentionally along those lines. The expense and the difficulty and some of the challenges that are inherent in building any type of facility is exactly where the heat in it can be. The way that they do this is by eliminating some of the seats that are traditionally down the right field line and the left field line, which are some of the most expensive to fill and some of the lowest in terms of the ability to generate revenue from them. In this particular case, the A's are expecting to be right in the middle of all Major League Baseball teams in terms of the attendance that they provide, but being at or near the highest in Major League Baseball in terms of occupancy rate by essentially building a smaller footprint relative to the facility that for baseball games overall. The second element of presentation today deals specifically with the funding structure. And I know there have been a lot of questions relative to the funding structure, so perhaps starting at its most basic is what is critically important. The overall project is expected to cost roughly $1.5 billion overall. The A's are willing to put in not less than $1.1 billion. Nevada, in terms of the economic development incentives and the package that we're going to talk about today, can be no more than $380 million overall. Critical to all of this is that as part of the agreement, including provisions that are specifically called out in Senate Bill 509, if there is any cost overrun, it is solely the responsibility of the A's in the construction or development of the facility. Additionally, if there are any losses that result from the operation of the facility, that is solely the responsibility of the A's. Obviously, building a project of this magnitude does not come without risk. Costs can ebb and flow. If those costs are above what is expected, again, solely the responsibility of the A's. The project structure is shown here in this sort of overly simplified flow chart here. The top element is the one that we just talked about. $1.5 billion stadium, 30,000 capacity, a retractable dome, some type of enclosed climate-controlled structure. The A's contribute not less than $1.1 billion. Nevada contributes up to $380 million. The new pieces are the three that are shown in the lighter blue color that's on your slides today. The first of those is the creation of a sports and entertainment improvement district. The second are transferable tax credits. And the third are credits toward a development agreement that will be required to be entered into between the A's and the host jurisdiction, obviously that being the county in this particular case. Each one of these is an important component in terms of how the financing, the public-private partnership is structured. In terms of the sports and entertainment district, it includes a broad cross-section of taxes that are generated solely by the project. As the Chief of Staff indicated, no increase in revenues, no new revenues are created in this financing plan. I've listed a few of them here: sales tax, live entertainment tax, the payroll tax, and many other taxes and fees will flow into a sports and entertainment improvement district. Those dollars will be used to offset bonds. They'll be issued and secured by those. The second element are transferable tax credits. These are essentially tax credits that are permitted by the legislature and will be utilized by the Stadium Authority Board to essentially give the A's a piece of paper that they can go to another company with, and that company can use that to offset their tax liability for gaming tax or modified business tax or payroll tax or insurance premium taxes overall. The final element is a development agreement. There's going to be off-site infrastructure costs for things like transportation and public safety and other elements that are out there. What the Clark County has agreed to is to provide a $25 million credit toward these infrastructure costs that must be outlined as part of the development agreement as the developer identifies the infrastructure that will be necessary to ensure that whether it's NDOT or whether it's the county is satisfied that the infrastructure requirements are necessary to support the project. With that, there are many other elements that are important here, right? The structure of the financing, the security that underlies the financing. And while I'm more than happy to do it, I think turning it over to Treasurer Conine now is probably the most appropriate thing to do.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Dondero-Loop, Chair Monroe-Moreno, and the members of the Joint Money Committee. For the record, I'm Zach Conine, and I have the privilege of being your Nevada State Treasurer. As you all know, the Treasurer serves as the state's Chief Investment Officer, and at the core, investing is taking a little bit of opportunity off the table now to create a little bit more opportunity later. Now, as anyone who saw my performance at the legislative basketball game halftime show knows, sports aren't really my thing. The most personally stressful thing I've done since being your treasurer was to throw the first pitch out at an Aviators game. The last time I played baseball was in 1992, when I earned and still hold the Little League local record for being hit by the most pitches. But luckily for all of us, I'm not here to talk about baseball. I'm here to talk about investments, the creation of thousands of jobs. We are here before you today to present one of the biggest investment opportunities for our state. It will help us create thousands of good-paying jobs, create new revenues into our state's general fund, and help to build upon Las Vegas as the sports and entertainment capital of the world. As your treasurer, I felt I had a responsibility to ensure that any stadium proposal that was brought forth to the legislature was crafted in the most fiscally responsible way possible. And the proposal that you have in front of you is the result of negotiations and some tough conversations we've had with all the parties to ensure that the state of Nevada's finances are protected. The proposal does not raise taxes at all. The project would be sustained by revenues generated within the Sports and Entertainment Improvement District. The state has the opportunity to recoup at least $90 million of its $180 million investment in transferable tax credits, and the state has limited its exposure throughout this project, making this a much more favorable to Nevada than we've seen in some other economic development projects. On the investment side, the state component
not my fault. Looks like Nevada's fault. I think they are overloaded with people watching this thing. So, but to answer your question, no, I don't, because the bond issue it's 120 million, which equals.
They are intended to be paid over 5 years, $36 million a year, starting from the approval of Clark County's bonds, which would happen around the end of 2024. The county portion of the investment is $120 million in bonds supported by the revenue of the stadium district. All tax revenues generated within the geographic footprint of the stadium would be used to pay debt service, the principal and interest, for those bonds. That includes sales tax, liquor tax, $8 million during the construction period as we get sales tax from the materials used in construction, and then are expected to start at about $10 million when the stadium opens, growing to about $22 million a year over the term of the bonds. Now, this does not include property tax because, of course, the stadium would be owned by the public, as most other stadiums are, or any other taxes specifically designated for a purpose within the county. The bonds are intended to be 30-year bonds, but this agreement, the revenue coming in from the stadium district, will run until the later of 30 years, the bonds being paid back, or the state's refundable tax credits being paid back. So that $90 million will come to us at some point in the process. We are also providing a credit enhancement for the county bonding. The county wishes to remain, and we respect, at 2 times coverage for the bonding. In other words, an expectation that the revenue generated by the stadium district will be 200% of the average annual debt service for that specific year. And so because of that, that would allow them to generate about $95 million in bonding. Using the state infrastructure bank or another modality that we control here in the government, our goal is to provide a credit enhancement, which will allow the bond proceeds to increase from $95 million to $120 million for a total of $120 million worth of bonding. The credit enhancement functionally works a lot like a parent signing on to a kid's first car. Right? And so by doing that, we provide additional security to the bondholders, and we're able perhaps to afford a little bit more than Clark County would be comfortable doing without that backstop. The intention is to fund that backstop with a general appropriation of $25 million into the state infrastructure bank, where that money will sit earning interest until such time that it needs to be used, if it ever needs to be used. And if not, we can, of course, use those funds for other purposes of the bank. The state's exposure would be limited to the first 50% of each year of debt service. So to scale this, we're looking at about $3.5 million a year in the first year, up to about $7 million a year in the 30th year. And that assumes that revenues for the stadium have fallen 2/3 of what they're expected to be going into the process. There's also $25 million in development assistance from Clark County, which Mr. Aguero mentioned. Now, if we can go on to the next slide. The waterfall of where those dollars that come in through the stadium tax district go is very important, and we've had a lot of conversations here. And on the right there, you can see what happens if revenues come in at or over expectations. Again, remembering this is over the 30-year period, and longer than that if the refundable tax credits haven't been paid off within 30 years. The first use of funds coming in would be the principal and interest payments of that year. The second is the operations of the Stadium Authority. So the Stadium Authority, of course, split costs between the new A's baseball stadium that we're contemplating here today and Allegiant Stadium. And we'd pay direct costs for each stadium would be allocated to them, and then joint costs like, say, board meetings would be split 50-50. Followed by that, the supplemental costs of maintenance and operations if failure to perform. So in the highly unlikely scenario where, let's say, the stadium started to be built and then wasn't finished being built, those revenues would be pulled out of the stadium tax district to finish that public asset. Unlikely, but it is in there. Number 4, allocation to the second year of reserves. So the first year of reserves will be filled by bond proceeds. When we issue the bonds, when Clark County issues the bonds, we'll fill up that first year of reserve. The second year will be filled during construction from the sales taxes generated by the construction proceeds. But in the waterfall for every year thereon, we will continue to fill up that second year of reserves. Because the bond payments, just like the taxable revenue, goes up over time, we will need to top off that second year of reserve each time because it'll be slightly bigger. Substantially similar to how the rainy day fund is currently tapped at 20%, but that 20% is not 20% of the next year because, at least in the current situation, we have more revenue coming into the state. Then any repayment of draws from the state line of credit, so the state's backstop would be repaid first if used. Then repayment from any draws from the bond reserves fund, so the county's backstop would be paid after the state's backstop. Then $5 million to capital reserve, which helps to make sure the stadium remains world class. And the expectation is, much like the Raiders deal, that the athletics organization would make a matching contribution there. Then number 8, repayment of transferable tax credits in excess of $90 million. So like I mentioned, we haven't done this before as a state. Generally, the state makes an investment into an asset like this and then participates indirectly through gaming taxes, room tax, etc. This is an opportunity, and we thought it was important for the state to directly participate if the stadium does better than expected, as Allegiant has, right? We want to make sure that we have an opportunity to find some upside there. Then $5 million to homeless prevention and assistance fund, which is held in Clark County, and then additional investment in the stadium or early repayment of bonds. Now on the next slide, we contemplate what happens if revenue is under expectations. So first, the cash coverage would be used first. Again, we're issuing, Clark County would be issuing bonds at 1.5 times. So in every year, the first third of money can decrease without any actual impact to the bonds. After that, the state's credit enhancement would kick in up to half of the cost of the bond payments in any given year. Then we would dip into the county reserves, and only then would the county general fund be tapped into, just like any other general obligation bond issued by the county. Functionally, that means that we would need to be under revenue pretty significantly for more than 4 years in a row before the county would be tapped into.
Madam Chair, with your permission, I'm going to continue with a few slides before I hand it off to Steve Hill. The next slide that I've shown you is the one that was alluded to by Chief of Staff Kiekeffer in his presentation or his opening remarks. And what it shows is the various ballparks that have been constructed over the past 20 years, plus or minus, and ultimately what the distribution has been between the public contribution and the private contribution. What you can see here is that this particular project is frankly more expensive than almost everything that's on here, as well as having more from the private sector than any other project that's been constructed. The amount of the private contribution is 75%. The contribution is 25%. And again, as the Chief of Staff indicated, that is favorable by historical comparison. The second chart that I wanted to put up is one that looks at the public funding share versus the metropolitan population, right? Major League Baseball. This predicates a need for assistance, as you might imagine, in terms of offsetting revenue generating capabilities. But you sort of get a sense that there's a distribution here. as the public funding has a tendency to go up, public funding has a tendency to be a smaller amount for where we're looking at here today for the Las Vegas A's. If we look at other small market teams that are shown up in the top left-hand quadrant of this, you see that many of them have much higher public funding shares than what's being talked about here. Again, suggesting that it's favorable by improvement district is important overall. The blue area represents the 35-acre site that the Tropicana is currently located on. The Sports and Entertainment Improvement District is expected to be roughly 9 acres relative to this to that site. There is expected to be some degree of flexibility in that while there's demolition going on or construction overall. But what Senate Bill 509 specifically says is that the Sports and Entertainment District can only be the area in which the stadium is there and property immediately required for the operation of that facility. So this is what we're imagining it'll be structured like overall. In terms of the public considerations, there are many of them. Again, I'll turn it over to Treasurer Conine to talk through these a bit.
Thank you, Treasurer Conine, for the record. First, we wanted to make sure that the state was protected from a cash flow perspective. The public will own the stadium. The A's will transfer ownership of the land underlying the stadium to the Stadium Authority and contribute the first $100 million in development costs before any public money is invested in the project. Additionally, the public holds the last $50 million in project cost until all final work items have been completed. We will enter into a non-relocation agreement, similar to the Raiders, where the A's will not be able to leave for less than 30 years without paying back every public dollar that has gone into this project. And if that did happen, however unlikely it is, then we would own a stadium free and clear, as well as getting paid back for the public contribution. And I think the bonding requirements, we've had a lot of conversations about Clark County and their involvement here. And the goal was to make them as comfortable as possible with the process. And we really want to thank Clark County for all the time that they spent here. But we looked at projected revenue streams generated by the stadium project and reviewed them for reasonableness by Mr. Aguero at Applied Analysis, by Goldman Sachs, Hobbs Ong and Associates, CSL, and PFM on behalf of Clark County. The Sports and Entertainment Improvement District will have, again, a combined coverage ratio of 2x, higher than the Raiders, which have a coverage ratio of 1.5x. And stadium bonds will require a full year's worth of reserves be deposited in a bank account the day the bonds are initially issued, and accelerated allocation of waterfall structures to create a second year of reserve fund. This is about as conservative as we could make the bonds, which is, I think, what Clark County has asked us to do.
Madam Chair, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Hill to talk about governance and oversight.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Steve Hill. I am the CEO of the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority. I am also chair of the Stadium Authority Board. Thank you for having us today. I'm going to echo the thanks that others have expressed, and everyone who has worked so hard to get to this point. I want to thank Major League Baseball and the A's for their interest in Las Vegas and their commitment to making this happen. This matters to Las Vegas. We are expanding our tourism base in Las Vegas, largely based on the growth of sports. We have claimed the title of the sports and entertainment capital of the world. In order to maintain that claim, we need to continue to take steps forward, and this is a big one. The eyes of the sports world are on us right now. They are going to continue to be on us. We've got some fantastic events coming our way, and those events have helped illuminate Las Vegas. It has helped illustrate that Las Vegas elevates the teams that come, the success they have, their ability to invest in future success, and we look forward to doing that with the A's. On a little more practical basis, there are some real aspects to baseball coming to Las Vegas that matter to the community. Typically, when we market to potential customers across the country and around the globe, about 70% of them are Las Vegas fans. They're very interested in coming to Las Vegas. They listen to our message. They experience what our city has to offer and keep coming back. There are typically 25 or 30% of the folks out there who are not necessarily fans of Las Vegas. But a number of those fans are sports fans. And the breadth of sports that we have brought to Las Vegas has allowed our message for our city to expand to more people. It's really the reason that we've seen the overperformance at Allegiant Stadium. It's why we are optimistic about this project moving forward. It expands the number of people who are interested in coming to Las Vegas. When baseball is played, typically, particularly through the summer, these are our toughest months. This is a counter-cyclical sport in comparison to the rest of the events in sports, professional sports teams that we have in Las Vegas. That's really beneficial from bringing visitors to Las Vegas. It's also important and beneficial to our workforce. For example, at the convention center, we have many concession workers, members of the culinary union, who work in different locations at different events when those events are being held, but then have to go someplace else for events to work when the events are not in the convention center. It's tougher to find that work. It's tougher to find those jobs in the summer. So it makes employment in these areas at stadiums, at arenas, at convention centers much more year-round and helps make those jobs better. The A's, I think many of you have talked with the A's. They are committed to coming to Las Vegas. You've probably seen that in the press as well. Major League Baseball is committed to making this happen, and that's great. But this bill is written in a way that is performance-based. We are relying on that commitment to move forward with the legislation, but the actual investment into this project will only happen after the A's have actually performed, after Major League Baseball has committed formally to allow them to come. So I'd like to talk just briefly about the governance and oversight that the Stadium Authority provides. There are three major agreements that have to be entered into in order to move forward. The first is a development agreement with the development partners. And in that, there are several requirements that are outlined in the law. One that I will point out is that in order to move forward, the development partners, which is the A's and whoever their partners are in this, have to not only show that they have the ability to financially perform their side of this deal, but that financial commitment has to be set aside and is irrevocable. So they can put cash aside, they can put a letter of credit from a bank or similar institution aside, or they can set aside a commitment for financing from a bank. But those are irrevocable. Once they are set aside, then we can move forward. So we know that funding will be in place and as the public invests their money. There is a lease agreement that we will enter into with the Stadium Events Company, the A's and their partners that will actually run the stadium. And then there is a non-relocation agreement, which the treasurer just referenced, that requires the A's to stay in Las Vegas for the duration of the bonds. If they try and leave, it first says that we have injunctive relief. We can go to court to make them stay. And if for any reason that fails, they have to pay off the bonds. They have to pay back the transferable tax credits in order to leave. The Las Vegas Stadium Authority is currently made up of 9 members. There are 3 members that are appointed by the governor, including the chair. The Clark County Commission appoints 3 members, and UNLV has a position on the Stadium Authority. Those members are appointed, and then those 7 members choose 2 additional members to the board, taking into consideration currently the recommendation of the Raiders. That is altered in SB 509 so that one of those positions would take into the consideration of recommendations from the Raiders. The other member of the board there would take into consideration recommendations from the A's. Right now, the Clark County Treasurer is an ex officio member of the board. SB 509 recommends that the state treasurer, because of the state's involvement now, also be an ex officio member of the board. Stadium Authority has a number of responsibilities, very similar to what was outlined in 2016 in SB 1 as it relates to Allegiant Stadium. We are a public body. We are subject to the open meeting law. We are subject to public records requests. So we function very similarly to the Las Vegas Convention Visitors Authority or local governments along those lines. We own and oversee the stadium and the land that the stadium sits on. We enter into the agreements with the team, the development agreement, the lease, the non-relocation agreement, and a number of other agreements that really support those 3 agreements. We now oversee in SB 509. This is different. We want to thank Yolanda King, who has talked with many of you about the community benefit plan, and what we are now recommending in this bill is a community benefit agreement where the Stadium Authority would have the responsibility to actually approve the plan that the team brings forward. That is not the case in the Allegiant Stadium legislation. So it's a plan that the way forward, this would be an agreement between the team and the Stadium Authority. And entering into that agreement would be a process that does take place in public because the Stadium Authority is subject to the open meeting law. We manage the waterfall that Treasurer Conine walked through. We manage and approve really the maintenance plan for the stadium itself. And currently, in the Allegiant Stadium deal, we manage any issues between UNLV and the Raiders. Section 4 is just some of the other project elements, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Guerrero quickly.
Madam Chair, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. I'm just going to touch on the very first of these, and then I'll hand it back to Mr. Hill to provide more context relative to the community benefits agreement and some of the other elements that we wanted to highlight here. There's been a lot of conversations about the Aviators, our minor league baseball team that exists in Southern Nevada. They will not be required to relocate. Matter of fact, the A's have said publicly, and I'm sure in conversations with some of you, that they believe that there's great value in having both teams there, being able to develop talent, being able to have that kind of connection with fans and some of the players that are up and coming. There's also been a great model for that between the Golden Knights and the Silver Knights, both of which coexist in Southern Nevada and both of which are thriving in that community. So wanted to make sure that we pointed that out. Steve, it's okay. I'll hand it back to you for community benefits.
Thank you, Jeremy. Steve Hill, Madam Chair. With respect to community benefits, the legislation requires that 15% in construction and operations both be subcontracted to small local businesses. It's a very high threshold that contractors, both the Convention Center and Allegiant Stadium, worked hard to achieve. That remains a requirement in this stadium part of P509. The language in The bill for the community benefit agreement, as I pointed out, is now an agreement, not just a plan. It is a requirement in this bill that agreement be reached in order to move this project forward. It's a similar requirement to the A's having to set aside the funding in order to move forward. It's the same level of responsibility on their part in order to move this project to the next step. There has been conversation around how much specificity regarding a community benefit agreement should be in law. It's our recommendation that the law be very direct, that this agreement must be in place and written the way it is. It is also an addition, after listening to your input, that this be reviewed every 5 years. And for that reason, we don't think specificity in law regarding what the community benefit agreement will be is the right policy. We think having the ability to adjust as the community adjusts, to review every 5 years, make changes to that plan to the benefit of the community is the right course. We've got some information and happy to get you more on the A's commitment to the community, but we obviously see this as an opportunity for all of the community to participate in the construction, the design, and the operation of the stadium. Given the location, there are a number of transportation considerations. It is an iconic spot. It is going to be a fantastic location to take in a baseball game. No place better in the world. But it is on Las Vegas Boulevard, and that brings its own set of issues that have been considered and will continue to be considered. This will be considered a high impact project by Clark County. That's an entire process that the county goes through with any developer, and that development agreement must be in place for this plan to move forward. No responsibility that the stadium authority has usurps any of the responsibility or authority that the county has to make sure all of those the necessary infrastructure investments are in place. Because of where the stadium is located, it will be one of the, if not the most walkable stadium for attendees of games and concerts and other events that will be there of any in the world. We anticipate that a third or so of the attendees at these games will walk from where they are staying in Las Vegas. There's a lot of work going on Tropicana already. The new intersection at Tropicana and I-15 is being built as we speak and will obviously be open by the time the stadium is open. There are plans at Paradise and Tropicana in the airport entrance there, as well as the entrance to UNLV. That project will be moving forward prior to the stadium being open as well. Reno Road runs to the east and the south of the Tropicana site. It's a very opportunistic way to get to the Tropicana currently and to the stadium once it is built. It will allow access to this stadium from the south and the east and the north down Koval, which then turns into Reno, without having to hit the intersection of Las Vegas Boulevard and Tropicana. As we do now with the Knights, and since we're here talking about sports and mentioning the Knights, go Knights, let's get it done tonight. How's that? The RTC will certainly have parking rides and bus service for locals attending these games as well. And this stadium will be the first stadium built in the Loop era. And you can look at the next slide. This is a depiction of how we are currently envisioning the site itself. The work on running the Loop, the Boring Company project, underground tunnels, from Thomas and Mack, where you may have seen the Boring Company got approval from the Board of Regents to buy some land to build a stadium, to build a station there next to Thomas and Mack that ultimately will connect through this Tropicana site, down Las Vegas Boulevard to Russell, and over to Allegiant Stadium, partially to allow UNLV students easy access to Allegiant Stadium for football games, but it also will be very useful for the baseball stadium here as well. That will connect up to the convention center, both up Las Vegas Boulevard, up Paradise, and up University. There's currently 65 miles of tunnels that have been approved from a land use standpoint from Clark County. So the Boring Company is just going through the building permit process to build this system. And then as we turn to other events that can be in the stadium, and Mr. Aguero highlighted the venue and the venues in the area. This is a unique venue. It is unique in terms of its use and in terms of the number of seats that it has. It fits in between the arenas that are in Las Vegas and obviously Allegiant Stadium. The LVCVA serves as the sports authority in Las Vegas. We keep a list of events that want to be in Las Vegas for which we do not have either available during the time frame that is needed or a venue that actually fits. The A's and others have projected 95 ticketed events at the stadium, 82 of which are baseball games. Our view at the LVCVA is that this projection is very conservative. What we've outlined here on this page, just showing you some logos, is just a partial list of events that have approached us that have interest in being Las Vegas, that don't necessarily either have the ability to have it in a venue that we have, such as the Major League Baseball All-Star Game or the World Baseball Classic. But when we modeled Allegiant Stadium and UNLV agreed to close Sam Boyd, we expected the events that were at Sam Boyd to move to Allegiant Stadium. That has not happened. It's much more expensive for those events to be at Allegiant Stadium. It's a much bigger location than it was at Sam Boyd. They are looking for a place to go. The baseball stadium would allow many of those to go there. We put NCAA's logo on this page, but there are conference championships in a number of sports, and that's obviously baseball in a baseball stadium, but things like volleyball want to be there. Soccer can be there. There are other soccer events that don't necessarily draw 60,000 people to town, but can draw 30,000 people to town. So a number of different opportunities moving forward with the stadium. And I will turn it back over to Mr. Aguero. Thank you.
Madam Chair, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. The final element of our overview today deals with the impacts associated with the stadium. One of the key elements that sort of drives much of what we'll talk about, both from an economic standpoint, and when I'm talking about economics, I'm talking about jobs and wages and salaries. I'm talking about business receipts. When I'm talking about fiscal, I'm talking about tax revenues that get generated. What drives that and what makes Las Vegas and Nevada so much different than almost any other venue is the fact that we draw so many visitors from out of town. And those visitors, they come and they stay in our hotel rooms and they eat in our restaurants and they shop in our stores, and it drives a tremendous amount of value. We're estimating for all of the events that are included about 2.6 million average annual attendees. That's driven by a number of factors, not the least of which is baseball plays 162 games a year, 81 regular season games will be played at the facility. And then you've got some, spring training, potential wonder game, spring training, and hopefully playoff games after that. Those drive that's a lot of people. In addition to that, as Mr. Hill said, there's the expectation of other events that are driving that. We have also, thanks to the LVCVA and many others, a tremendous amount of insight relative to the visitors' utility of these major assets that we have. We know how many visitors are coming and utilizing Allegiant Stadium, for example, which is substantially higher than what we preliminarily estimated. We know generally the number of folks that are using T-Mobile and other facilities that are out there. The estimates here is about a little less than 30% of the total folks will be visitors that are attending events at the stadium. I want to make it clear, these are not just the baseball games. These are other events that would be there. What is also not included are things like private events that have a potential of being at the facility, and we haven't even attempted to count things like tours and things like that. From that 762,000 attendees from out of town being there, we don't count that from a fiscal or an economic benefit standpoint. If someone's going to come to Las Vegas anyway, maybe they're going to go to a show, maybe they're going to go to a baseball game, maybe they're going to go to a couple of restaurants. I suppose we hope they do all of those things. But if they're coming to Las Vegas anyway, and they just decide to go see a baseball game, we're not counting them here. We're only counting what we classify as incremental visitation, and that is the 405,000 that you see there. These are folks that tell us that but for the baseball game or the event that's being driven there, they would not have made the trip and come to Las Vegas. As I mentioned before, when we were sitting before you talking about the Raiders moving to Las Vegas in that facility, we made some estimates relative to that, and now we actually can see some of the data that's taken place. Not only have the Raiders been a tremendous draw in terms of their ability to bring people in from out of town, but many of the concerts have 90% of the people that are in there saying that they would not have come to Las Vegas but for the BTS concert or Taylor Swift being there, which is a tremendous draw. Every one of those visitors that show up mean jobs and wages and salaries, and as you all know, generate a tremendous amount of public revenue at both the state and local level. These estimates are based on any number of data points that we have. I should also mention that they are also based on over 15,000 surveys that were done by the Oakland A's, both of folks that are inside the state of Nevada and their willingness to buy tickets and season tickets or game tickets and suites and things like that. But also surveys of folks outside of the state of Nevada, principally those in the American League West, and their willingness to get in a plane or get in a car and come to Las Vegas. I was light relative to the numbers on Allegiant Stadium. I believe I'm probably light here, but it seems being conservative is probably the best thing to do. In terms of the stadium's economic impacts, there are three of them that we'll talk about here today. The first is the one-time construction impacts, right? We build a stadium, we hire people, we buy a bunch of materials in order to do that. Those materials and that labor are subject to retail sales and use tax and modified business tax in the state of Nevada. I'd love to tell you that I'm capturing all of those, but I'm not. But those are really important to us. They also generate a lot of jobs, right? We need folks that can do all of those type of things, right? Those materials, that labor is critical. For purpose of this analysis, we looked at a $1.5 billion stadium project. Obviously, any cost of land or anything would be above that. Don't have economic impacts associated with with the acquisition of land. And we also reduced the estimate to $1.2 billion to reflect the fact that some of things will happen outside of the state of Nevada. Obviously, the A's are committed to having as much as possible within the state. The vast majority of the construction has no choice but to follow that trend. But when we look at that, about $898 million, we include both the direct impacts and the indirect impacts associated with that, are generated as a result of the construction of the project. That's 14,600 direct, indirect, and induced person years of employment. And again, there's a distinction here. We talk about construction related activity. We talk about one person employed for 1 year overall. $2.1 billion of economic activity, a little less than every $1 that they spend. There will be an additional dollar that's spent from suppliers, an additional dollar that's spent in communities. When those construction workers go back to their neighborhoods and spend dollars in grocery stores and doctors' offices and restaurants, that creates other other jobs in terms of that ripple effect. Beyond that, we have the annual operations impact associated with the A's. Again, I'm looking at the totals here for purposes of simplicity. Half of that comes from the direct activity of the stadium. The other of that comes from the ripple effect that happens throughout the community overall. We're thinking about operations here. It's not just the day-to-day operations of the stadium. Sometimes folks forget that the Oakland A's is a business in and of itself, and they bring all of their finance folks and marketing folks and, things like scouts and other things that go in to a professional baseball team. In total, the direct and indirect impact of that employment is estimated at about 8,000 jobs overall. Importantly here, this includes both full-time and part-time employment. It's a little different than we were talking about in terms of construction. As Mr. Hill mentioned, right, these jobs and the way our economy has evolved is that one person oftentimes has multiple jobs within our community. They work at the convention center. They work at Allegiant Stadium. Maybe they drive an Uber, and then they work at other facilities, right? That evolves over time, and we've attempted to capture that. When we look at the average annual wage and salaries over the 31 years of the project, it's about $437 million a year, or about $1.3 billion of both indirect, induced, and direct impact overall in terms of output. Finally, the last piece is incremental visitation. Again, this is not total visitation. That would make these numbers substantially larger. But the estimate is that those incremental visitors that come to an event at this facility will spend about $571 million on average each year over the next 30 years. That spending will result in economic activity in our core resort industry. In total, that economic output is about $900 million overall, and about 9,000 jobs. We include the direct, the indirect, and the induced. And obviously, that number's lower. We're only talking about the direct jobs, but our ability to bring in incremental visitation and thereby bring in dollars from outside of the state gives us a bump that, frankly, other communities just can't benefit from in the same way. That, Madam Chair, with your permission, I'd like to turn it over to the treasurer to talk about some of the fiscal impacts associated with the project.
So when we start looking, Treasurer Conine for the record, when we start looking at the bottom line here, in construction, we expect to generate $38.8 million in total tax revenue, vast majority of which is the sales and use tax, but of course, modified business tax paid on the payroll of the individuals who are helping construct the facility. From an annual operations perspective, about $10.9 or $11 million in sales and use tax, modified business tax of $2.8, and $3.3 million in other taxes, and we'll talk about those in just one moment. And then getting back to Mr. Aguero's comment about incremental visitation, we expect that incremental visitation, including gaming tax, room tax, and the rest, will generate about $36.5 million a year, including $14.1 million in sales and use tax, $8.7 in room tax, and $9.1 in gaming tax. We talked a little bit about being conservative when it came to the revenue sources that we looked at. And so the model takes into account sales and use tax, modified business tax, live entertainment tax, and commerce tax generated by the site. But there are other taxes that will be generated by the site that we have not modeled. A, because we're not sure exactly how much a liquor tax is going to happen at A's games, so I expect quite a bit. But also because things like franchise fees, business license fees, and personal property tax can vary based on structures. So what I'm saying here is there are revenues that will be able to go to pay back those bonds that are not currently contemplated within the model. But those four that we have contemplated, we expect will be the lion's share.
Madam Chair, that rounds out the presentation that we've prepared for you today. If it would please the committees, I'd be happy to do as brief as possible of a page turn on the bill itself and highlight the key provisions of the bill, or if you prefer to handle it some other way, we're happy to do whatever's appropriate.
Thank you very much for that offer. Mr. Aguero, I think it's important to do not a long, but at least a short page turn of the bill. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, for the record, Jeremy Aguero, I'll try to do exactly that. If I'm being too brief or too long-winded, please put me on the right track. SB 509 is prepared for you. I'm going to start on page 3 overall with section 1, simply the name of the act, the Southern Nevada Tourism Innovation Act. We've talked a great deal about its importance of this in terms of continuing to advance our communities, our state's tourism industry. In section 2, there's a series of legislative findings. These essentially identify the special need associated with this project and why why legislation like this is so important to bringing something and making something like this possible. Section 3 provides a series of definitions. I'm now on page 5, Madam Chair, for the definitions, including the baseball stadium events company, the board of directors, the county commission, what bonds are to include both the original issuance as well as any necessary refundings. I won't go through all of these definitions. The one that's probably most important is the actual Major League Baseball stadium project that's provided on page 6 that says, hey, look, sorry, that sounds a little silly to say, that essentially says this has to be a world-class baseball stadium and it has to continue to do that going forward. At the bottom of page 6 is section 18. It authorizes the stadium authority to enter in to the agreements and take the powers and authorities that are necessary to develop a stadium project. On the top of page 7 is section 19. It creates a separate account for the MLB stadium project to ensure that the monies that are coming in for the existing Allegiant Stadium project are held separate and apart from any monies that would otherwise be created and utilized for this project. Section 20 is the creation of a homeless prevention and assistance fund, as was talked about a bit earlier. Section 21 establishes the powers and authorities of the stadium authority to take in audits, to require reports, and is probably as important as any to take any other action that may be necessary, convenient, or desirable to carry out the powers necessary with respect to the Major League Baseball project. Section 22 allows the stadium authority to enter into those agreements that Mr. Hill talked about earlier, a development agreement, a lease agreement, a non-relocation agreement, and any other agreements that are necessary for the purposes of getting this project structured in such a way that it can have the appropriate development and then oversight. On page 8 is the elements of the development agreement. It has to be identify a site. It has to be first class in terms of and maintain that standard. It has to have a capacity of 30,000 seats and several other requirements that are included there. The development agreement begins on page 9. Most of that information is included along page 10. The lease agreement requires that the lease be no less than 30 years and allow for renewals at the discretion of the stadium authority. It requires full operational control for the MLB baseball team. That is to say, they can't be interfered with, and they are responsible for all of those operations. Again, if any operations losses, they're responsible for those. The development agreement that I just mentioned, any cost overruns, they are responsible for those. It requires an annual audit. It requires that the team agreement entered into with the stadium agreement also be for 30 years. It mentions the confidentiality requirements and several other provisions, many of which have been discussed here today. On page 11, in section number 5, the non-relocation agreement. Treasurer Conine talked about the fact that that must be for the same length as the term of the bonds, 30 years. That if the A's choose to leave, they have to make the state of Nevada whole relative to that, where the state of Nevada would own that stadium free and clear. Section 23 at the end of page 11 talks about the community development agreement, and it provides that it is designed to create the greatest possible participation by all segments of the community in the economic opportunities available in connection with the design, the construction, and the operation of that facility. It requires to be updated every 5 years, and the creation creation of a community benefits oversight committee. Section 24 at the end of page 12 provides the confidentiality provisions that were discussed earlier overall. On page 13, section 25 allows the project, provides specific provisions to the project relative to being excluded for some public works requirements, but making sure that it is included in terms of prevailing wage requirements. As I'm sure this committee is aware, many of those agreements having already been entered into overall. On page 15 is section 26, which is the small business requirement. Essentially what it says is that 15% of the Major League Baseball stadium project must be subcontracted to small local businesses. On Allegiant Stadium, that was 168 separate small businesses with almost $300 million in activity meeting this requirement, I would suggest very successfully so. On page 16 at the bottom of section 27, it allows for the use of PSLs. Whether they will be used or not, I don't think anyone is certain. Not very commonly used in the context of baseball stadiums, but it preserves the right for the A's to utilize that if they decide that they would like to do so. On page 18, section 28, this is the requirement that the county create a sports and entertainment district after getting the signal from the Stadium Authority Board that it's time to create it. Obviously, in this particular case, we've got an existing use. So the end of that existing use is necessary for that to happen. In section 28, it also makes it clear that where the sports and entertainment district has to be concluded. I'm now looking at section 28, subsection 1, paragraph B, that it include only the land on which the Major League Stadium project is or will be located and any surrounding or adjacent properties necessary for the operation of Major League Baseball Stadium project. So this is intended to identify things like, parking structures, things like that that would be directly associated with the project itself. Section 29 is the waterfall provision. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I think that the treasurer went through that perfectly in what he went over. The provisions that he went over are enumerated one after another on page 19 overall in terms of the waterfall itself. On page 19, at the bottom of that, on the bottom of page 18 going to page 19, we have all of the taxes that are included in the stadium improvement district. And again, these are all the dollars, just to make sure that I was being clear, that go in, that will ultimately come through that waterfall. It includes sales taxes. It includes modified business taxes, commerce taxes, liquor taxes, all of the ones the Treasurer Conine indicated. And it also includes on page 20, if there's any taxes that weren't specifically enumerated, they are there. It requires that the state and local governments create commercially reasonable ways to essentially identify those taxes, and it compels the businesses that are operating within that district to collect and remit those taxes in accordance with the requirements set forth by the county. It requires that the funds be distributed and be deposited into the account for the repayment of all of those bonds. On section 30, beginning on 22, this is the credit enhancement provision. Again, Treasurer Conine did a great job talking about the way the state will set up a line of credit in the event in an amount equal to 0.5 times the revenue that is generated that will go directly to the principal and interest. Again, the additional 0.5 of that, you combine those two, you get 2 times coverage, providing the level of coverage that was a condition precedent for the county in terms of what it was seeking to do. There are many more provisions here, including a provision that allows this credit enhancement to be reduced if revenues come in over expectations and to be reinstated if they go up really high and then come back down along those lines. The idea is to have a structurally and fiscally sound program for the public contribution overall. On page 24 begins section 31. This is the transferable tax credits. Again, these were discussed overall. Transferable tax credits can be taken against the gaming tax, payroll tax, or insurance premium taxes, up to $180 million in total, 90 million of that, which would be subject to repayment through the waterfall, as was discussed previously. The taking of those tax credits is outlined in the section over 5 years. There are a series of milestones, including the issuance of the bonds, the construction of the facility, a certificate of occupancy, and then completing the first year of operations overall. On page 27 is section 32. I talked about the money going in to the waterfall. I'd like to now talk about the money coming out of the waterfall. I will not, again, go through these in any type of specific detail as we go through it. Treasurer Colnine did an excellent job of that. The first section talks about what happens before the bonds are issued. The second section about what happens after the bonds are issued. And then after the bonds are paid off, the taxes, 10% of the taxes remain. All the rest of the money goes to the taxing authority that imposed the tax in the first place overall. Skipping to page 31 and section 33 provides this section 33, sort of a catch-all provision, if you will, that outlines considerations, provisions, if you will, that must be included in any document, any agreement that the Stadium Authority Board enters into. And there's a few here that I think are particularly important. On page 32, the total amount of public funding for the construction of the project cannot exceed $380 million. You'll notice on page 32 in sub 2, it also provides that if the amount of taxes that are collected before the bonds are ever issued, inclusive of the $25 million in the development agreement credit that the county is putting in, again, cannot be greater than the $380 million overall. Within this section, it specifically says that the A's must donate the land underlying the project to the Stadium Authority Board that will own the project straight away, as well as what the treasurer talked about in terms of the project being owned by the public and exempt from property taxes overall. First $100 million, I'm now on page 33, paragraph 2, says that the developer must pay the first $100 million. On page 34, the last $50 million is held back until the project is absolutely completed. Other sections in here talk about what is necessary for these dollars to be released by the public, including hiring of an independent accountant to monitor them. On section 34 is the county's issuance of the bonds. It says that the board of directors from the Stadium Authority will make that request, and the county commissioners shall issue those bonds if certain determinations have been made, including that they've entered into a lease agreement and a development agreement and all of those things that we've talked about before. This section provides section 34, subsection A, subparagraph B, the 2 times coverage inclusive of the state backstop that was included. Mr. Hill talked about any number of things that were included relative to the fact that the A's have to provide their funding at the same time the state provides its funding. They have to have enough money to be able to construct their share of the stadium with and including a budget that has already been approved by the Stadium Authority Board, all of which is included on pages 36 and 37. Page 38 includes section 35. This is the power and authority of the Stadium Authority Board, and when that power and authority is exhausted. You'll see 2 dates that are commonly referred to in here. One is 12 months, the other is 18 months. If Major League Baseball fails to provide that the A's can relocate, if the A's fail to elect to relocate, they have 12 months to do that. The Stadium Authority Board can extend that period out to 18 months. Now, that not only includes the provisions that are necessary for the A's to move, again, their election and Major League Baseball, but also the entering in of the development agreement, the lease agreement, and all of the other agreements that are necessary for the project to move forward. On page 39 is section 36. As Mr. Hill indicated, this provision allows for both the treasurer to sit as an ex officio member of the Stadium Authority Board. It also provides for the MLB team to have an advisor to advise the Stadium Authority Board relative to one of the appointees, the ad hoc appointees, after the bonds have been issued. Fast forwarding to page 42, and page 42 provides the section 37. Again, this is just continuing with when these members are appointed. That language is on page 43. Section 38 provides the $25 million appropriation to be put into the state infrastructure bank or to be otherwise utilized for the state's backstop for those bonds. Section 39 provides legislative measures necessary for you to be able to consider this bill, as has been explained to me. And Section 40, Madam Chair, rounds out this bill with the effective dates once implemented, saying that it becomes effective upon passage and approval. With that, again, I'd like to just reiterate our thanks for your patience while we went through this, and we stand ready to answer any questions that you or the committee members may have.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate that. And before we go any further,